Okay, welcome everyone for tonight's program for Ladies of the Lights with Dianna Stampfler. I'm really happy that everyone's here. It is being recorded, but I'm still glad you're here. Please stay. We have really great information, brand new information, Dianna says, so we'll be the first to hear some really great stuff, so we're lucky here. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them into the chat box, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So I'll make sure those questions get asked, but there is a Q&A section at the end, so you can wait until then. But I will let Dianna take it from here.
Thank you very much. So I am super excited to share this presentation with you. And as mentioned, I did a little bit of digging on a lighthouse keeper. I learned some new information recently and dug into the family tree of this particular woman. And so you guys are going to be the first group of mine to actually hear her story. And fortunately, it's also the last light in the presentation as well. So I'll make you wait until the very end to get that particular story. So just a little bit of background about myself. I was born and raised in Southwest Michigan. Went to Western Michigan University. If there are any Broncos out there, go Broncos. And I actually started researching lighthouses in Michigan in the late 90s. I was working for an organization called the West Michigan Tourist Association, which is based in Grand Rapids. And they, to this day, still publish the official Lake Michigan Circle Tour Guide. And it's basically a magazine and a map that covers the entire 1,100-mile route around Lake Michigan. And when I started working for that organization, my first job was to catalog all of the lights on Lake Michigan. And this was, as I said, late 90s. So I was actually the first person on staff to have a designated email address and to have internet access in my office. And doing a lot of the research, even back then, involved calling to museums and communities and going to libraries and researching some of these lighthouses. And I was building a database back then of the lights on Lake Michigan, and it was the name of the light, it was what city it was in, when it was built, how tall the tower was, if it was an active light, if there was a museum, could you climb the tower? Did they have a bed and breakfast? Because we have a handful of those. Did they have a keeper program? And two of the areas that I was researching, or two themes that came up during the research, was that I was starting to see, as I was asking these lighthouse groups for interesting information, was that they had a lot of female keepers, and they also had a lot of ghost stories. And so over time, I developed this program and another one on haunted lighthouses of Michigan. And in fact, in 2018, wrote a book called Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses. And these are themes that I think really resonate. I mean, Ladies of the Lights, particularly this month when it's Women's History Month, a chance to shed light on about 50 different women who have served at lighthouses just in Michigan. So this is the list that I've compiled. And the earliest female keeper that we have actually dates back to 1849. So that's 12 years after Michigan became a state. Our first lighthouse here along the Lake Huron shoreline in Port Huron was Fort Gratiot, and that was built in the 1820s. So within 20 years or so of the first light in Michigan, we have a female keeper. And these women served up until more recent times. We had a woman who was a caretaker as late as 5 years ago at one of our lighthouses, even though it was operating as a museum and not an active light. What was interesting about lighthouse keeping in general, many of the women were the wives of male keepers, or they were daughters of the keepers, and they would often be appointed into their positions because the male keeper was either sick or incapacitated in some way or had passed away. So very rarely did a woman come in solely on her own to serve as a lighthouse keeper. And it was also very common for the families to assist the male keeper whenever necessary, because when you were living at a lighthouse, you were receiving a salary, the head keeper would receive a salary, and you were allowed to live in that house free of charge. And of course, you would have all of the things that you needed to keep that house going provided to you. So if for some reason a male keeper became sick or bedridden, the family stepped up, because if they did not, he would lose his job and they would lose the salary and they would lose their house. So it really did become a family business at that point, and everyone helped out whenever possible. Now, lighthouse keepers, one of the things that was really interesting about these women is that they were earning the same salary as a male counterpart. And that was huge. If you're thinking of the 1850s, 1870s, 1890s, these women were making the exact same salary as a male at that particular light. Now, the salary changed based on the lighthouse, the location, whether you were in charge of one light or a set of range lights where there were two lights that you had to take care of. But we will often see that when one of these women took over for their husband, the salary range stayed the same, and that was pretty significant. However, the salary wasn't great. These lighthouse keepers were earning anywhere from $400 to $800 a year in these positions. And just for comparison, a school teacher in the 1880s was making less than $500 a year. So in that same range, but a postmaster or a postmistress, which was a government job, they were earning anywhere from $1,000 to $6,000 a year. So, which is interesting, because lighthouse keeping, if you've ever gone and visited a light, climbed a tower, it's a pretty physically demanding job. You climbed the tower, you carried pails of hot oil, you had to polish the lens, trim the wick, take care of the house, take care of the lawn, take care of your children, the grounds, the garden, the farm animals. I mean, you had a lot of responsibility, and you were getting typically less than $600 a year for that position. Seems to me I'd have probably opted for the postmaster job, just for a little bit of a higher salary. So what we're going to do today over the next hour or so is I'm going to take you on a geographical tour of Michigan. We're going to start along the Lake Michigan shoreline. We're going to make our way up to Lake Superior and then come down the coast of Lake Huron and end in the Detroit River. This is White River Light Station in Whitehall, and this is a family photo of the Robinsons. The two gentlemen on the right-hand side closer to the tower, the man on the far right is William Bush, and he was the lighthouse keeper at one point, and the gentleman next to him is Bill Robinson, and that's his grandfather. Bill Robinson and his wife Sarah came to the Whitehall area in the 1860s. They had 7 of their eventually 13 children. Now, let me go back and show you that. That is not a particularly large lighthouse. Granted, 3 of their children did not make it into adulthood, but they had a significant number of family members in that house at any given time. Now, clearly, some of the older children have been moved out and got married by the time some of the younger children came around. But it's actually interesting, because when they first arrived in Whitehall, this lighthouse didn't even exist. They got there, and Bill Robinson was so surprised that there was so much traffic coming out of the White River as they were harvesting lumber to rebuild Chicago after the Great Fire, and that there was no lighthouse. And so he started to document the number of ships, what they were carrying, where they were going to or coming from. They was documenting all this and sending it to the lighthouse service in his petition to have a lighthouse built. And finally, they started building it and completed it in 1875, and he was appointed the first keeper. So that's when he and Sarah actually moved into the lighthouse. And it wasn't very long after that, in 1891, that Sarah had a stroke and passed away. Now, it is said that both Bill and Sarah's spirits remain on at this lighthouse. I find it kind of a romantic love story that their spirits are there together in the house that they helped build here in Whitehall. This is the room where Sarah's ghost tends to hang out. They believe it's the nursery. Now, White River Light Station has had several other female keepers in its history, and Frances Worry Johnson is one of them. Frances and her husband Leo Worry came in at this light in the 1840s, and at this point, the lighthouse service had moved from the U.S. Lighthouse Service into the Coast Guard, and they started in the 30s and on after that, either hiring Coast Guard officials or civilians to staff the lighthouse. And so that's how Frances and Leo ended up here at White River Light Station. Well, Leo was originally from the Upper Peninsula, and he wasn't really fond of lighthouse keeping, and he was definitely not fond of the Lower Peninsula. So he ended up divorcing Frances and moved up to the UP near Marquette and took a job at the Huron Mountain Club, which is a whole nother story for another time. Frances stayed on. She remarried a man named Marshall Johnson, and she stayed on at the lighthouse and tended to this light until 1954. And one of the interesting things, I had a chance to meet her several years ago at a presentation in Whitehall. She was such a spunky lady. She didn't have very many good things to say about that first husband, but that was part of her charm. But one of the things that she was really excited about was that she was asked to be in the 1950s on a TV game show. And she made her way to New York, and she was a contestant on What's My Line. Now, if you are familiar at all with 50s television, this is a show where a person with a unique occupation sits there and a panel of 3 judges, I guess you call them, ask a series of questions and they try to guess your job. Well, they were unable to guess that she was a lighthouse keeper. They got as close as guessing that she was a government employee, but she won $50 as a contestant on that show. And during the Q&A later, they've recently put that episode on YouTube, and it runs about 5 or 6 minutes, but I'll put a link to that in the chat at the end of the program if anyone wants to watch it. It's really quite interesting. So here, this more recent photo, that's Frances sitting in the chair. And she, like I said, she was just a spunky lady. She passed away 5 or 6 years ago and was one of the last of our female keepers, of the actual lighthouse keepers who tended to the light during its service. Now, the woman standing next to her is Karen McDonald. And Karen came into the lighthouse in the 1980s. At this point, it was a museum, and she and her son lived in the part of the house. They kind of divided it out into a duplex. They lived in the back half, and then she ran tours and was the curator of the museum at White River Light Station until about 5 years ago, when this light transferred on over to the Sable Point Lighthouse Keepers Association, which is based in Ludington. Now, if you have never been out to South Manitou Island, I highly recommend it. It is one of the islands along with North Manitou that are part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. And so you can take a ferry boat out of Leland, and you can actually do a day trip out to South Manitou Island. They'll drop you off, and then they go over to North Manitou and drop off and pick up the campers, because it's you have to stay the night on North Manitou. And then they'll come back and pick you up and take you back to the mainland, or you can stay in camp, rustic camp on South Manitou. In the 1860s, when they were building the lighthouse, they had about 200 residents on the island. So you can see from this map, there are several farmsteads scattered throughout the island. They had a cemetery, a one-room school. They had a Coast Guard life-saving station. And of course, then they had the lighthouse. And one of the most noted families on the island were the Sheridan family. And they have several members of the Sheridan family who went on to become lighthouse keepers, not only in this area, but throughout the southern part of Lake Michigan as well. Now, this is Aaron and Julia Sheridan, and Aaron was a Civil War soldier. Now, given that lighthouse positions were government appointed, often from the office of the president, it was very common for veterans of the Civil War to be serviced in lighthouse keeping. And so Aaron was hired in, and he and his wife Julia came into the South Manitou Lighthouse, and they raised their 6 sons while they were there. Now, Aaron, as the head keeper, drew a salary probably around $350 to $400 a year, and Julia was an actual official assistant keeper. Now, the wives in the family were always unofficial. But if the lighthouse service recognized the spouse or another member of the family, and they were hired in, they would get an official title, and they would also draw a salary. So Aaron made about $350, Julia made about $150, so $400 for the family of family of 8 with the 6 boys to live in this island lighthouse. And they served at this light for about 12 years. And they were there serving until a tragic accident occurred in March of 1878. And actually, next Monday will be the anniversary of this shipwreck accident. And they had actually hired this gentleman in the other photograph, Christian Ankerson, to sail them across in a boat similar to this Mackinac. And this is a boat that lighthouse keepers would have had at their lighthouse for various activities around the island or through their service. And because Aaron only had his one arm, and you can kind of see it's his left arm is just hanging there, he was unable to move it, so that he couldn't sail. And so Christian was hired to take them across to the mainland in Glen Arbor. And on the return trip, the boat capsized. And that day, Aaron and Julia, and they also had with them their 9-month-old son, Robert, they all passed away that day. Christian did hang on to the overturned boat. He was rescued, and there was this inquisition, and they actually, this newspaper article talks about how they determined that it was just a simple accident due to weather, that it was not his fault, and that he was not going to be held accountable or responsible for the deaths of the Sheridans that day. The bodies were never recovered. The remaining brothers were said to walk the beach for weeks waiting for the bodies to wash ashore, which they never did. One of their sons, their second oldest son, George, went on to become a lighthouse keeper himself. He served at several lights down in the southern part of Lake Michigan, and he and his wife, Sarah, and their 3 children lived at the Kalamazoo River Light, which once stood in Saugatuck. And this light was built in 1859. They actually came in 1900, and George was the only officially trained lighthouse keeper at this light. And he served here for 14 years, and he was responsible for the closing of the light when it was decommissioned in 1914. However, there was a situation about that time in that George had suffered with some depression issues after the loss of his family so many years ago. And he ended up checking himself into an asylum for treatment for that depression. And his wife actually was the one who stepped up as the interim keeper and officially closed that light in 1914. About this same time, Sarah informed George that when he transferred to another light, and I want to say he was going to Michigan City, that they would not be going with him. They were going to stay in Saugatuck, and they actually lived in this little gray building, which is now a gift shop. And Sarah took in laundry to take care of their children. And because of the depression, because of the situation with this family kind of breaking up, it was more than George could handle. And he ended up taking his own life while he was visiting a cousin who was tending to a light in Grosse Pointe, at the Grosse Pointe Light in Evanston, Illinois. And it was quite a tragedy. It was written about in the newspapers, and a lot of the area lighthouse keepers actually took up collections and provided them to Sarah so that she would have the money to raise their children while she lived on in Saugatuck. This is Sarah Lane and her daughter Minnie, and Minnie was a child here when her mother Sarah and her father John began their lighthouse service, and they actually started down in southeast Michigan at the St. Clair South Channel Range Lights. And so they would have lived in the larger lighthouse, and they would have had to take a boat every day over to the second ranged light and make sure that both of those lights remained active. So they served at this lighthouse for a few years before they transferred on up to the Old Mission Point Light at the tip of the Old Mission Peninsula in Traverse City. And when they got there, John was an assistant keeper first, and then he was quickly promoted to head keeper. And over the course of time, Sarah was assisting John with his duties because he had developed some poor health, and he actually ended up dying in 1906. They were there for quite a bit of time, over about almost 20 years. And so during that time, Sarah was helping out significantly with the duties. And I love this article because it shows us that even in the early 1900s, that the local media, the local newspapers were fascinated with these female lighthouse keepers. And so this is an article from the Grand Rapids News and talks about her many years of service. And what's interesting in this article, she tells a story of one night during a storm when she was going to the top of the lantern room to tend to the light. And apparently the lantern room at the top of this one wasn't particularly windproof. And so the storm was brewing and the wind was kicking up. And if you've ever climbed a lighthouse, you know when you get up to the lantern room, there's the metal floor with the trap door. And so she went to open that trap door to climb up the final steps to get into the lantern room. And she put her hand on the floor to kind of help herself up, and the wind blew that door down onto her hand. And it actually chopped off the top of one of her fingers. And in this article, she talks about how she didn't realize it for several minutes. She was actually taking care of the light when she noticed there was blood everywhere. And she looked down and noticed that part of her finger was missing. And she says she thought if she'd have thought about it, she would have fainted away. But she was so set on getting the job done and tending to the light, make sure that sailors that were out there in that stormy waters of Lake Michigan and Grand Traverse Bay could see the light, and she didn't have time to worry about her finger. And that really spoke to the dedication that these keepers, both men and women, had for their service, intending to the light no matter what the circumstances were. St. James Harbor Light, this is at Whiskey Point on Beaver Island, and Beaver Island has about 600 year-round residents now, and it is accessible by ferry boat out of Charlevoix. They also have 2 airports on the island, so you can fly out there. The photo on the lower left, those little young ladies are Effie and Mary McKinley, and they're our youngest female lighthouse keepers. Now, they clearly were not that age at the time that they were helping their father there, Peter McKinley, with his duties. They were teenagers when their father took ill, and in the 1860s, they assisted him with those duties. And he finally retired in 1869, at which point Clement Van Riper and his wife Elizabeth came in to serve at the lighthouse on Beaver Island, one of the 2 lighthouses. This is the one that's in the harbor, in the village, and then there's another light at the south end of the island. Elizabeth talks a little bit about their lighthouse service in her autobiography called The Child of the Sea and Life Among Mormons. Now, if you're not familiar with the history of Beaver Island, in the 1860s, they had a significant Mormon population that was, they were hoping to rival what Brigham Young was doing in Utah. And the congregation was led by a self-proclaimed king by the name of James Strang. And she talks about living and growing up on the island during the Strang era, as well as her time as at the lighthouse. So she assisted Clement for 3 years, and he actually ended up dying during a shipwreck accident. There was a ship called the Thomas Howland that was sinking in the harbor, and he went out to try and help people get off of that, and he drowned. And in her autobiography, Elizabeth goes into great detail about how tragic it is to lose a loved one by drowning and never being able to recover their bodies. She also lost two brothers on the Great Lakes. And because of that, she felt a renewed sense of dedication and responsibility to the light and to work hard to prevent others from dying out on the Great Lakes. So she was quickly appointed as the head keeper. During this time, she remarried in 1875. She married a man by the name of Daniel Williams. And she ended up staying at the lighthouse on Beaver Island until 1884. But at that point, she did not retire. She actually transferred to the Little Traverse Lighthouse here in Harbor Springs. And this light had just been completed in 1884. And she came in as the very first keeper. And she served here until they retired in the year of 1913. Here we have Elizabeth and Daniel. She never had any children, but they had a lot of friends, and they would host parties at the lighthouse. They would play music. They would have lawn parties. And this lighthouse actually sits at Harbor Point. So Harbor Springs, this area of Harbor Springs, is a private, secluded area. There are no cars allowed. This is where the Wrigley family had a house. You know, this was old school money back in the day, and they became friends with those folks and hosted these fun little parties at the lighthouse over the years as well. So they ended up serving here until 1913. She also was very well written about. She served over 44 years, I think one of the longest serving female keepers in the Great Lakes region. I've actually been trying to get her inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame now for about 10 years. Last year, she made it to the semifinal round. So I actually have to finish up her application this month and get that in. So maybe this year will be the year that she gets inducted. After retirement in 1913, Elizabeth and Daniel moved to Charlevoix, where they lived several more years. And they passed away within 28 hours of each other in January of 1938. They are both buried at the cemetery just south of Charlevoix, right by just at the intersection of 31 and M66, right out by the airport. The Squaw Point Lighthouse, the second keeper here was a man by the name of Lemuel Marvin, and he was also an injured Civil War soldier who was given the appointment. He was also a Baptist minister, and he had only been at the lighthouse for 6 months when he died. And his wife, Kate, who was the mother of 10, was then appointed as the keeper. She had 5 children still living at home when she was in charge of the lighthouse. And I believe that she had more, outside of Sarah Robinson, had more children than any of our other female lighthouse keepers. She ended up serving at the light for 6 years after her husband's death before she remarried and then retired from service. This is Mary Terry, or a replica of her. This is the Sand Point Lighthouse in Escanaba. And that photo there on the left is the only photograph that we believe exists of Mary Terry. Her husband, John, was actually appointed the first keeper of this light in 1868. But between the time he was given the job and they finished and started to run the light, he died. So she stepped in and served for 18 years at this lighthouse. And I was actually here over the weekend. So this photo I just took this weekend. And I wanted to show you specifically this side of the lighthouse because there was a really interesting situation. Mary was there in March, on March 5th of 1868, excuse me, 1886, there was a fire at the light. And what was interesting was we showed up in Escanaba on the anniversary of the fire. And on this particular night, March 5th, just after midnight, the fire began, and they actually found Mary's body in the lower level where that door is, and that was the storage room. And it was very odd, and there are some concerns about her death. And even to this day, they're not sure that it was an accident. So let me go back here. Her bedroom was on this side of the house upstairs. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, she was in the lower level. It's also the lower level that you can see in the photograph on the right, past this cutout of her. So why was she at 1 o'clock in the morning in the storeroom? There were a couple theories. One was that the chimney had started a fire on the backside and she went down to try and put the fire out, which means that she would have went downstairs and went to the back half of the building. Or there's another theory in that the door there to the lower level, when they investigated the next day, when the embers had finally cooled and they found her remains, that door had been kicked off of its hinges. And the hinges were broken as if somebody kicked the door in to break into the house. And Mary was known to keep her money in the lighthouse. And there's speculation that someone went there to rob her. She heard the door break in. She went downstairs to investigate. There was a struggle. She was killed. And then the person who killed her started the fire to make it look like she died accidentally. And there are dozens of newspaper articles very similar to these two. And if you go through, it talks about a faulty furnace, but it also talks about robbery and murder as a cause. Very little of her was found, which meant that the fire was contained significantly around her body. And she was known to keep money in the lighthouse, although they did find that after the fire had been put out. But to this day, still a mystery in Escanaba of what happened to Mary Terry. We're going to step outside of Michigan just for a second. And this is the Apostle Islands, which are actually part of Wisconsin. But we have one of our keepers that is in Michigan, one of our female keepers who actually started in the Apostle Islands. And they have a very interesting story about one winter when they decided to stay on Michigan Island at their lighthouse. This is Anna Maria Carlson. Her husband, Robert, was the head keeper there, and their children, Cecilia, who was about 3, and then the twins, Robert and Carl, who were about 1.5 years. And in this one particular winter, they decided instead of going to a mainland house for the winter, they were going to try it at the lighthouse, even though the service was was down for the winter, probably from December to April, maybe a little longer in Lake Superior, and the light was not activated daily. They could stay at the light if they wanted. So this one particular winter, they decided to stay, and Anna was upset because the hired girl that was supposed to be there to help them take care of the children slipped away with some fishermen and never came back. And so it was this family, and then Robert's brother, who was an assistant keeper at the light. And I show you this picture. This is actually a different lighthouse in the Apostle Islands, but I want to just show you what winter looks like in this particular area. Probably not this winter because we had a pretty mild winter in the Great Lakes region, but in a rough winter, you have just this amazing ice, cold. You've got islands, so the wind is bustling from the north, and it really is quite an experience. And so what happened was that Robert and his brother had taken the dogs to go fishing one day. And at the end of the day, Anna Maria was sitting there waiting for them to come back, and they never arrived. And she sat there by the fire all night long, wondering what had happened to them. And the next day she got up and they still weren't back. And so she went and milked the cow and got the eggs from the chicken and fed the children and kept a fire going because she knew when they came back, they would be really cold from their experience. Day 2, she goes to bed and they're not back. Day 3, they're not back. And she's beginning to think that they are never coming home, that they have died out there in the cold winter days. Well, what they have determined later when they did make it back was that they were on the south side of Michigan Island and the piece of ice that they were on broke off and it drifted all the way to Madeline Island. And when they got there, they had to make food out of some flour that they found and some melted snow. And they finally found an old boat that had a hole in it, but they were able to find stuff to patch it. And they had to row back across 8 miles of stormy, icy water to get back to the island. Well, in 1930s, they actually had a newspaper article about this experience that showed up in the Detroit News. And for years, I had the transcript of this article. And just a couple of years ago, someone at the Detroit News, I emailed and they sent me the full page. It was a whole front page and then some story all about the situation with them. And she said after this, they never stayed on an island lighthouse again after that one winter. But they did go on to serve for many more years after this. They left Michigan Island in 1898 and went to Marquette. They stayed here until 1903. And then they made their way to Whitefish Point, and they were there for almost 30 years. They came in 1903 and they retired in 1931. And these 2 children are their grandchildren. These are their daughter, Cecilia, was a teenage bride and a teenage mother. These are her children, Bertha and Robert. And Cecilia had been married and divorced to the same man twice. And he eventually abandoned the family. And she became institutionalized and actually died of tuberculosis at the Newberry Asylum up near Whitefish Point. So Bertha and Robert were raised by their grandparents at the lighthouse. And Bertha lived into her 90s, and she was actually instrumental in some of the restoration at Whitefish Point and getting it to become the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum and renovating some of the Coast Guard buildings, which are now operating as a bed and breakfast. And then also donating many family artifacts from the Carlsons. So if you go up to Whitefish Point for the lighthouse itself, you can see some of the family artifacts that she has donated. Her spirit actually still haunts the lighthouse, and I believe it's her mother's spirit who haunts the light at Marquette. So a little bit of family tradition and ghost hunting in that area. Out on the Keweenaw Peninsula, we're going to backtrack a little bit to the Keweenaw Peninsula and the Eagle Harbor Range Light. And here Mary Wheatley came in after her husband was serving. This range light operated, this is the rear range light. This one sat on land. And then there was another light about 1,000 feet toward the water that sat lower. and ships would actually line these lights up in order to find safe passage into the harbor or into the marina. Marianne Wheatley came in and she served at this light for about 6 weeks in 1889. And then she served until 1905. She kind of came and went a little bit with her service. But the Wheatley family is well known in the Eagle Harbor area, serving at several of the lights in this region. And at Manitou Island, we have Mary Corrigan, who was a female keeper. She was an assistant. She and her husband kind of tag team a couple of lighthouses in this area. And I remember, gosh, maybe close to 20 years ago now, I happened to email the Keweenaw Land Trust and heard back from descendants of the Corrigan family who told me this story about how she went into labor at the lighthouse one day during service. And so they put her in a boat to take her to the mainland to have the baby and to, to catch up with the midwife and have the baby. Well, she delivered the baby on the boat. And Mary instructed them to turn the boat around and to go back to the lighthouse so that she could go back to work. And that may seem a little extreme. It wasn't her first child, but that just really shows you, again, the dedication of these women who are dedicated to the lighthouse keeping service. This is another relatively new story. This is Henrietta Berg. And Henrietta and her husband actually lived in the Keweenaw Peninsula. They had an island called Berg Island. And then they also had a house in the mainland near Beta Gree. And I stumbled across a blog post last summer, and it turns out it was written by Henrietta's great-great-granddaughter, Nora. And so Nora gave me all of this detail about how they had Berg Island where they would go and fish because there was such great fishing around the island. And then they had their house on the land. And so when her husband would go out to go fishing out near the island, he would say, Henrietta, please put a lantern in the upstairs bedroom window so that when I come back after dark, I can easily find the house. So she started to do that. She'd go upstairs when he would leave, she'd put a lantern in that window, and he would come home safely. Well, it didn't take long before the other fishermen in the area started asking her to put the light out for them. And so she just became accustomed to putting the light out every night in that lantern, in that window. And what was interesting is that she was doing this for years before a lighthouse was ever built in Beta Gree. So here we have Henrietta again in the middle inside of her house. And this is the current lighthouse there. So she was serving as an unofficial keeper of an unofficial light. And then this light was eventually built. This one was up for sale, and last year it sold. It was listed for $495,000. I'm not exactly sure what the sales price was, but I was just on their website last week, and it does say if you're visiting in the area and you want to take a tour, to email them, and it sounds like they'll let you go through the light. Now we're back to Marquette. So we have the Carlsons there in the 1903 for a few years. And then we also had, prior to that, back in the 1860s, Anastasia Truckee. They called her Eliza. And her husband, Nelson, here was a Civil War soldier. So from 1861 to 1865, while he was off serving in the war, she tended to the lighthouse. She was very well respected in town. The Native Americans loved her. They called her Mother of the Light. And she had such a great relationship with them, as well as with the local townsfolk, that when there were disputes between the Native Americans and the locals, they would call Eliza in to kind of help communication, help mediation. And years ago, I actually got some letters from one of her descendants who talked about these incidents and these stories. And she said in this letter that thanks to Eliza, several of the local residents, local men, were allowed to keep their scalp because she was able to calm down disputes and arguments between them and the Native Americans. Now, they had a couple children. One of them was Frances, and this is her husband, Mr. Shanley. Their daughter was or is Chris Shanley Dillman. And Chris wrote a book called Finding My Light, and it's basically about a 16-year-old Emma Truckee growing up, the daughter of a Civil War soldier living on a lighthouse on Lake Superior. So a historical novel based on her mother and her grandmother and the stories that come from that service. And now we're over here to Lake Huron, our last few lighthouses. This is the old Presqu'île Lighthouse. This light did not operate for very long. It was actually decommissioned after just about 30 years of service, and they built a new light just north of this that was better suited based on its location and also by the tower height. But one of the most noted families in the Presqu'île area is the Garrity's. So on the left, we have Mama Garrity, Mary. Her husband was Patrick Sr. They had a daughter, Anna, who tended to the range lights. And then there were 3 or 4 brothers who served either at the new light, assisted Anna at the range lights, and they were also, the first family at the new Presqu'île light. So it really was a family business for them. They kind of went back and forth and helped out and shared in the responsibilities at these different lights. And if you go back here, you can even see they have a sculpture, a metal sculpture of Anna Garrity that is on display outside of the range light there, dedicated to her years of service. In the 1960s, the old light actually became a museum, and Lorraine Harris and her husband George were hired to tend to the museum and to run the gift shop. And they were there for about 20 years before George passed away. And Lorraine stayed on for several years past that. I met her, gosh, maybe close to 20 years ago at the Great Lakes Lighthouse Festival in Alpena, which is no longer held. And I got to see her about 5 years ago. I gave my haunted presentation on the lawn at the lighthouse because her husband's ghost is still there in great force. And she was wearing the same outfit, which I thought was kind of funny. And I told her, I said, I wish I could wear an outfit that I wore 20 years ago, but that clearly is not the case. But she's just, again, a spunky lady. And I think, what was it? In the summer of 19, she turned 90, so she'll be 92 years old this year. And she's still around, and her daughter takes her to various lighthouse activities in the area. The Saginaw River Range Light. This one is now owned by Dow Chemical, and it is maintained by the Saginaw River Marine Historical Society. The first keeper here was Peter Braun. He's the gentleman in the center. This is Julia, his wife, and one of their children, DeWitt, there below them. In the group photo, Peter's in the center, Julia is in front of him, and then DeWitt is to her right. Peter came in to the lighthouse in 1866, and he became bedridden almost immediately with some undisclosed injury or disease. And so Julia stepped up and was an acting keeper. She was never officially recognized, but for 9 years, she tended to that light, and DeWitt assisted her with that responsibility. Peter passed away in 1873. And at that point, Julia was officially named the keeper of record. She received the title, she received the salary. 2 years after that, she remarried in what the locals tell me is a scandalous marriage, because her new husband, George Way, was 13 years younger than she was. And right after that, George, who had no experience in lighthouse service was put in the head position and she was demoted. And then right after that, they actually abolished her position altogether. And shortly after that, the second husband died and she just left service altogether. And she is buried in a cemetery in Bay City between both of her husbands, which is kind of interesting. Peter's grave there has actually fallen into the ground, and the Historical Society is trying to get that restored and have that standing back up here before long. The Point Out Barks Lighthouse, this is in Port Austin, so this is in the tip of the thumb, and this is where our first female keeper in Michigan hails from. Catherine Shook was the wife of Peter Shook, and Peter came to the lighthouse with one of the local doctors to help Catherine along in 1849. She was sick with something, and when he went to take the doctor back to Port Huron, they traveled by boat, and the boat capsized, and the doctor and Peter drowned. So Catherine was named head keeper at this point. They had, I believe, 8 children. And within just a month or so after Peter drowned, there was a fire at the lighthouse. And the lighthouse, the bottom picture is what the light kind of looks like today. The sketch is what it looked like originally. The house and the tower were actually separated. So there was a fire in the house, in the chimney, and Catherine and the children had to vacate. She received some burns, and it just happened that the inspectors showed up the next day, or a day or two later, I guess, and determined that the fire was not her fault. It was a bad chimney, and he ordered it to be replaced and the dwelling to be fixed, and to do it quickly because they were all sleeping outside. Now, thankfully, it was summer, so that they were able to do that. And in this letter, the inspector even talks about the loss of Peter, and asks for a few other things. Like he tells him, well, while you're here, paint the tower as well, and take care of this light, so that this widow can have this nice light for their home and to raise the family and make money for the family. Peter's body was never recovered, but his name is listed on Catherine's headstone at the cemetery in New Baltimore. Now, this is the new stuff. So this is an exciting story that I recently heard about. And so you guys are the first group to hear this from me with this type of detail. So this is the once standing Mama Judah light. It was located and built originally in 1849 in the Detroit River. It crumbled away and was rebuilt in 1866. And it was had the last keeper was there in 1921, and in 1950 it crumbled and fell apart. And the island itself now you can't even see in the Detroit River. It's like totally gone. It's underwater. Now I don't know if we get really low water levels if we'll ever see it again, but currently it is not there for anyone to see. Originally the island was about 30 acres. And some people called it, instead of Mama Judah Island, they called it Mammy Judy, after a Native American woman who lived in this area. And it's even noted as early as 1796 as Jones Island on maps that the French were drawing of the Detroit River area. Now, one of the mid-lighthouse keepers was a man by the name of Barney Littlegot. And so he is here. These are his siblings. He was keeper 6 of 13. And this is a story that's quite interesting to share. Saphariah, I don't have a photo of him, but he was the oldest. And we have brother John, and then Barney, and then their sister Mary, who was the youngest. And there's some detail out there, but not a lot. But one of the stories I found said that their mother died during childbirth while giving birth to Mary, and that their father died about 10 years later. He was a local farmer, had probably 240 acres at one time in this area. They were kind of in Taylor, and then also down by the Dearborn area. And so after the parents died, well, after the mother died, Mary was sent off right away because she was a brand new baby, and clearly a father, farmer, and brothers would not know how to take care of her. And she is noted as a foster daughter to a man by the name of Patrick O'Hearn and his wife, Margaret. And by the age of 3, she is noted as an acknowledged child, which I think means that they've adopted her at this point. And the brothers were living with a family named Williams, Rebecca and Edward Williams. And I'm not really sure where John was at this particular time, but we'll come back to some of these stories in a minute. Now, there's very little known and certainly no photograph that I found of the oldest brother, Saphariah. John and Barney, well, there was one thing I found. There was a lawsuit that was in the newspaper where he sued some guy for taking off with his wife. That's about all I was able to find about him. John and Barney were soldiers. Now, Barney married a woman by the name of Caroline Amelia Taylor in 1861. The next year, John and Barney head off in the Michigan 24th Infantry Company K to serve in the Civil War. They mustered out of Detroit August 15th of 1862, and John actually died in the very first battle that they fought together at Fredericksburg, Virginia, just before Christmas of 1862, about mid-December. Barney continues on. He serves in several major battles. He's in the Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsville, the Battle of Cold Harbor, and the Battle of Gettysburg, where he loses a couple fingers on his right hand. He musters out in June of 1865 as a sergeant, returns back to Michigan as a farmer, a husband, and a father. He and Caroline have 5 children. However, only 2 live on into adulthood. So Barney then, as customary, a Civil War soldier, he comes in, he's appointed as the lighthouse keeper of the Mama Judah Lighthouse in February, March of 1873, and his wife is with him. Well, he dies 2 days before Christmas, 1873. He's only there 9 or 10 months. And so he passes away, and Caroline is appointed to serve as a temporary keeper while they decide to go and look for a formal keeper for her position. But during this time, several lighthouse keepers in the area start sending letters to the U.S. Lighthouse Service, and they're actually recommending that they give Caroline the title and the position and the pay as the head keeper. That finally, it takes like 2 years, but finally in June of 1876, she is hired in. She's making $520 a year and serving as 11 years as the head keeper of this lighthouse before she resigned in 1885, gets remarried. And I believe this is a picture of her standing on the porch of the lighthouse. She passed away December 7th of 1903, is buried at the Woodmere Cemetery in Detroit. Barney is actually buried in the Oakdale Cemetery, also known as the Sandhill Cemetery in Taylor in Wayne County. And even the historical marker for the cemetery mentions him by name, spells his name wrong, but mentions him by name as a soldier who fought in Gettysburg, and that his burial is in this particular cemetery. Caroline got remarried. She married a man, and they're buried in the Woodmere Cemetery here in Detroit. So not with the same place as her first husband. So that's that part. Now back to Mary. Mary, back up again, show you Mary. Mary is the little sister of the Litigant brothers. And this is where the story gets kind of interesting. Mary was a young girl when she first saw William Smith Ford, who at the time worked for her father on their farm, and eventually the two would marry. In 1861, they would have 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, their first child being the one and only Henry Ford. So that's my big story about how Henry Ford's aunt and uncle were lighthouse keepers of the Mama Judah Lighthouse in the Detroit River. Mary Ligadot Ford died in 1876 at just the age of just 37. Henry was just 13 years old. His youngest brother, Robert, was just 3, and they are all buried at Ford Cemetery in Detroit. Now, if you're looking for more information about female lighthouse keepers in Michigan or beyond, these are the books that really inspired me early on in my research. The book, Women Who Kept the Lights, the top third from the right, was written by a mother and daughter team who now help with archives of the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And that was the very first book I read about female keepers. And then from there, I went to Fred Stonehouse's books, Women of the Lakes 1 and 2. And then I recently acquired a first edition of Elizabeth Whitney Williams, A Child of the Sea. There's also a children's book about her. I mentioned Chris's book about Emma Truckee at Marquette Lighthouse. We also have Mind the Light, Katie. And then several years ago, I gave this presentation at the Michigan Women's Historical Museum and Hall of Fame in Lansing. They were having an exhibit on female keepers. And that was the first year I nominated Elizabeth Whitney Van Riper Williams to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And Pat Major was the head of the museum at the time. And we went and had lunch at the time of my presentation. And she told me that she wanted to write a book, asked my permission to use the title of my presentation for her book. And I shared with her all of my early research. And then she took that and went so much further and dug in and grabbed a lot of detail about not just female keepers here in Michigan, but just details about some of the historical data of female keepers in the country as well. And so her book is readily available. Many of these are at the library, or you can get them through interlibrary loan. And they just really give great stories there. Now, this is my plug for my book, Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses. And if you look at that map, 7 of those lights that are rumored to be haunted, you got to see tonight and to hear some of the stories of their female keepers. And I don't know if that, it wasn't like I sought out the female stories for this book. It just turned out that some of the best ghost stories happened to involve some of our female keepers as well. So when we get into the chat, I'll actually share a link if anybody is interested in purchasing an autographed copy of that book as well. And then if you're looking for additional lighthouse research or information, these are some websites. The Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association is based in Mackinac City. They have a list of all the lighthouses in the Great Lakes. They can tell you which lighthouses have keeper programs or operate as bed and breakfast. They can tell you about their cruises that they offer. They have a couple lights that they maintain. One is the St. Helena light in the Straits of Mackinac. You can volunteer to go out and help them with projects there. Barry Pepper was the president of GLICA. He passed away in February of 2019, but they have maintained his website, which I consider to be one of the best out there. If you go to that, you can search by Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, or Lake Superior. You can search by Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin. And each lighthouse has a page with tons of information, photographs, lists of keepers who served there. And when I was always doing research, if I came across something new, I would send it to Terry and see if he could help me verify those facts. The U.S. Lighthouse Service also has a catalog online where you can search lighthouses as well as ships, lighthouse keepers, just great information there. Again, I'll throw these links in the chat. So if you want to visit them, you can either take a picture of that screen or click on them in the chat and open them up in your browser and then check them out later. And then I will also put in the chat the link to that YouTube video of Frances Johnson from What's My Line. She is the first contestant on there, so that's really cool. You can watch the early part of that and not have to watch the whole episode that airs there. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen and we will open up the chat, and we can either do chat questions or unmute folks and ask questions that way as well. I'm open to either option. All right, I see a few questions down here, or a few comments. Well, thank you all. Oh, boldface on that list of the people that we were chatting with or that I was introducing you to. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask away.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. I was a volunteer keeper at the Grand Traverse Lighthouse, and I wonder, by Northport, and I wonder if you have any stories about that.
They have, I have a list of other keepers, and I think that they had at least one. Let me see. Scanning through my list. They actually have a keeper, the keeper program. I'm actually writing an article about that. They had okay, so here's a story I have from Grand Traverse. There was a woman by the name of Priscilla Parker, and it says in a letter, keeper Henry Shetterly wrote to his son Seth in March of 1873. He mentions this woman, but does not describe his relationship with her. In the letter, he went on to say that she had bound out her oldest child, but that he convinced her not to bound out the other that she had. Perhaps she was a widow supporting her children and served as a housekeeper in exchange for room and board. In a letter to the superintendent of lights, Shetterly claimed that she kept the lighthouse from September 11th to the 30th of 1873 inclusive, and requested authority to pay her as a laborer. Keeper Shetterly died a short time later on October 21st of that year. So that's the story I have from Grand Traverse. I don't think any women from Round Island. A lot of sometimes if it was not a populated island like Beaver Island or South Manitou, they would not put women out there. They would only put single men. You would never find a woman or a family or wife or a family out, let's say, on any of the Straits lights, like the crib lights that are offshore. They would reserve those for single men because it was a little too extreme. I don't believe I have any stories of women from Charity Island either. Big Sobble had a couple. Pentwater. I want to find a picture of the keeper from Pentwater. Her name was Annie McGuire, and she was fired for drunkenness and irregular habits. And I kind of was curious as to what she looked like. Like, she sounds like a troublemaker. There was another woman at the Saginaw Lighthouse after Julia left, and their last name was Buzzard. I thought that was funny. There was a woman in St. Joseph. Her name was Jane Enos, and she was significant because her husband died. She got the position, and over the course of her service, 2 of her assistants were men. So if you think about during this, time period, in the 1800s, she was there 1876 to 1881. 3 years of that, she was the boss of a man in a government job. So that was really kind of an interesting story as well. And you didn't see that very often. Michigan City had a couple examples of that over the years as well, but not very often did you see any of that. All right, here's the link for What's My Line. I put the links in there for those three organizations that I mentioned earlier, the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, terrypepper.com, and then the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And then let's throw this one in. This is if you want to order an autographed copy of my book. Harriet Colfax, she's a great one. Harriet Colfax is Michigan City, Indiana. She got the appointment because her cousin was Schuyler Colfax, who was vice president under Ulysses S. Grant. So she pulled in some family strength. She served 45 years and had men and women serve with her. She ended up passing away within 6 months of retiring. So many great stories. I did a presentation last week with the Door County Maritime Museum and got a chance to look at some of the female keepers on the other side of the lake. And so that was kind of interesting, stories that I wasn't familiar with some of the Wisconsin women. There is my email address if anybody has any further questions. You can also find me on Facebook. Promote Michigan is my company. And I'll put my website in here too. And you can look at other upcoming presentations. I have several other topics. Working on a new book, also lighthouse related, and that one will again be a dark side, much like the ghost stories. This one will be about lighthouse keepers who died under tragic and mysterious circumstances, not necessarily related to their jobs. We have a couple of them that died that we don't know what happened. Of course, I shared with you what happened with Mary Terry. We have a couple keepers who are believed to have been, others that have been believed to have been murdered, a couple who have committed suicide. So a little dark side of the lighthouse service with that one, and that should be out next March. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in this evening. We are recording this, so I think the library is going to put it out on Facebook. So if you have friends that missed it, feel free to direct them to the Facebook page for the library and they can check that out at a later time.
Yeah, it will definitely be on our website. And I'm going to save the chat. So if you want to email Dianna directly, I'm sure she could share some of her links, but I can also try to pull most of them and shoot out a link to everybody that was registered, especially for that YouTube video. I think that'll be really interesting. Yeah.
It is really kind of fun. It was funny because they had started putting those videos out about 10 years ago. And so I'd go back once a year, I'd go and see if that one was there. And about 3 or 4 years ago, it finally showed up. And I literally was so excited to see that video of her.
Well, good. Thank you, Dianna, so much. And I really hope that we can get you in person in the future, hopefully soon. But this was good. I'm glad that we were able to see you virtually.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I do look forward to live presentations and getting back out and seeing everybody in person.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for attending tonight. And have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Shall I end the meeting?